Storm builds are by far one of the most popular builds in the game, and it's not even close. Here's the thing. It is very strange because they don't even span elemental types. It's not like the Pyromancer or anything else like that. No, it spans everything. From incantations, ashes of war, and sorceries. However, just because it's accessible to everything doesn't mean it's really optimal for everything. So let's go ahead and look into it, because this is where things get interesting. Now here's the thing, I'm going to look at this as a level 150 build because that is probably the most common meta level, and that's also where hybrid builds become optimal, but not overpowered. This is especially important when you look at, let's say, the heavy infusion versus the quality infusion. So let's look at every single setup and see which one is the most viable, starting off with the worst, which is intelligence, which has a great spell, but it's not as good as the Ashes of War variant that you could get on a quality, strength, or dexterity build. And then when you look at the Ashes of War, you really don't benefit too much from them compared to pretty much anything else. This is because there's less you add to any storm setup, because you're really not doing the highest amount of weapon damage, and your one sorcery is outcompeted by a weapon skill that doesn't scale on anything. And any other build could pretty much use a lot of the Storm Ashes of War better than you can, which is saying a lot because the next one is Faith, reaching down to number 5 on the list. The thing about Faith is, at least it can actually buff the physical damage from Bullet Ashes of War like Stormblade, and you can buff pretty much every other damage type you have with anywhere within any of these Storm Ashes of War, because Faith is the master of buffs. Additionally, similar to Intelligence, you do have a spell which is not that great either. I mean, it still doesn't add too much to a build, however, it's at least something. In addition, you do have the Divine Beastman's Greatsword, which is not really that great because it doesn't stun lock the same way that Stormcaller does, which it gets outcompeted by, but at least it's something, and it's a unique weapon that kind of does its own thing. However, it is still a decent somber weapon that can do a decent amount of damage, but still, Stormcaller is better in like almost every context. And finally, you do get more weapon damage type options with both Flame and Sacred. And having those additional options does make it better than Magic, especially since Magic really doesn't have enemies weak to it. It doesn't have enemies strong against it either, but variety is very important when you look at these kind of setups. Now we go to the next one on the list, which is going to be Arcane. And Arcane is actually where things become a bit competitive. And that's because Arcane's really good at doing status effects. Like, that's kind of its thing. So you actually do get a lot of blood loss buildup whenever you're using a lot of your AoE abilities. Now, here's the thing. Occult isn't really going to scale the Storm Ashes of War, and you're going to get more out of, let's say, Bloodflame Blade setup. And if you're really not using any weapon buffs, yeah, Occult could actually be really good for some of these weapon setups. However, the only thing that really carries this one is status effects. With how that anything else would be better, which can be seen with the use of something like Bloodflame Blade, which can ignore motion values, which means for the most part it's actually better to use Bloodflame Blade than, let's say, any other physical infusion, at least for blood loss buildup. Which means you're probably not getting the best blood loss buildup from going the Occult Defendy, and even if you are, you're losing out so much physical damage and even some fire damage. Which effectively means you get so much more off of a quality build, a strength build, or dexterity build, but it's still something that actually has a lot going for it. Now, yes, you lose out on weapon buffs. Yes, you lose out on the Bullet Ashes of War damage. However, it still at least adds something to the build. Now, here's the thing. For this to also be optimal, it has to also have blood loss buildup, because otherwise, pretty much any other physical infusion will do what Occult does, but better. And even then, it still underperforms compared to the next few on the list. But I still recommend Arcane builds at least considering some of these, especially Stormcaller, as part of their arsenal. Now, do not kill me for ranking this one this low, because it is still a top tier option, and it's still one of the best physical builds in the game. However, number 3 is going to be Strength. When it comes to Storms, it loses out on the next two. Now, Strength is kind of the king of two-handed damage, but when you note that Ashes of War do not scale off your two-handed AR, just either your one-handed AR as well as your bullet calculation, that two-handing doesn't really matter. In addition, when you're on a Storm setup, you may as well be wearing the Divine Beast helm. And when you put that into the equation, yeah, quality actually does kind of compete really well against strength, at least within the level 150 bracket, which means you usually have about an 80-20 split between dexterity and strength. But when you try to match that to 50-50 and then add in things like Millicent's Prosthesis as well as the Beast Helm, yeah, quality is actually going to outperform it. At least when it comes to very specific weapons, specifically Milady, Knight's Greatsword, etc., etc. However, strength does have one thing that it does better than both quality and dexterity, and that is going to be piercing damage. And this is due to one weapon and one weapon alone, the Rusted Anchor. Now, realistically, can you build this on a dexterity build or on a quality build? Yes, you can, and you're only going to lose out on about 2 to 3% damage. However, that's significant enough to actually matter. However, what's not insignificant is what you can do with something like the Greatsword and Storm Stomp, specifically in PvP. So yeah, Storms can have some specialties and strength builds that quality or dexterity builds really can't match. However, is it overall better? No, no it's not. At least when we look at Storm builds. The biggest thing this comes down to is the fact that Strength in general has a lower one-handed AR than a dexterity build, so therefore it's going to do less damage. And all of that, sometimes in the best strength weapons like the Knight's Greatsword or Mesmer's Spear, yeah, in those cases with those specific weapons that can actually use Storm Ash's War, they're definitely better on a quality build, especially when you use Helm, or even possibly Millicent's Prosthesis, giving you an effective boost of 8 levels, which is kind of significant when you're looking at about a damage difference of like 2 to 3 to 4 to 5%. Not only that, just because of how Bold Ash's War is scaled, yeah, quality is almost always going to outdo strength in terms of Bold Ash's War outside of debatably early levels. Which means if you're using Stormblade, yeah, you're going to get more damage on a quality build than you're going to get on a strength build. Now, this right here is going to lead us to, well, number 2 on the list, which is quality. And quality is great. I mean, first of all, one, because it's like strength and dexterity, you get Zammer's Curve Sword, which means you get a better magic damage option than Ent builds, at least when it comes to storm-based abilities. In addition, you do get the Stormhawk Axe and the Veteran's Prosthesis, which are kind of decent weapons for lightning damage on quality builds, and they're all storm-based. And on top of that, quality's decent with bow builds, which means, yeah, you could use these Storm Arrows. And when it comes to other projectile options, specifically Stormblade, well, yeah, it's the second best build to use a Stormblade. In fact, being the second best overall. And while one may argue that quality builds aren't as good as, let's say, strength builds in terms of raw damage, when it comes to your actual weapon options, especially in PvP, you get weapons like Milady, which Milady is best on the quality build if you focus on the two-handed AR. And so is the Zweihander and the Knight's Greatsword. And if you're counting using the Helm, so is the Mesmer's Soldier Spear. Which means as long as you don't mind wearing this helmet, then yeah, you're pretty much gonna have a better setup on a quality build than you're gonna have on a strength build, at least when you're using storm-based abilities. Now, are there some weapons that strength's gonna do better in? Yeah, absolutely. It's not gonna be able to compete with, let's say, the Gus's Greatsword, or even the Shamshir or Flamberge, or even the Claymore, which is just predominantly better on a heavy build, at least within the level bracket of 150. In addition, quality is technically the second best stat for static effect builds because a lot of the weapons that combo really well into each other either scale best on dexterity or quality. And this is true with both native value and even the physical infusions. That's at least if you have about a 80% point investment into offensive stats. Here are the few weapons I recommend for a quality build if you want to go this route if you're playing on meta levels. This can be expanded upon if you wear the Divine Beast Helm. And the final note, since you're playing quality build, you have a high degree of versatility. Now, as a physical infusion, I do not believe it's better than a heavy infusion, but it's still, overall quality is still better when it comes to storm-based builds. However, overall, is it the best one? No, because dexterity exists, and dexterity is kind of the best at skill damage, at least when it comes to non-colossal weapons. And this is simply because dexterity kind of has the best Bull Ashur War scaling and the best one-handed AR scaling for medium class weapons, which pretty much includes all the Storm Ash's War. And yes, can you blame this on the Great Katana, the Guardian Sword Spear, and a lot of the other new weapons, including, let's say, the Lizard Greatsword? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the only physical damage type that kind of scales better on strength than dexterity would be something like the piercing damage from Rusted Anchor, but even then, it's not by enough to be significant. And even then, all Storm abilities have at least some sort of bullet scaling, and that's gonna do better on a dexterity build than a strength build. But when it comes to these medium class weapons, you also gotta understand how these interact with these Ash's War to begin with. If you're using, let's say, a Great Sword or using a Great Katana, you're probably using the Ash's War Stormblade as a replacement for your regular attacks in PvE, and when you look at that, it's just going to do better on a dexterity build. And this applies to both Great Swords and to Great Katanas. And if you're using Stormcaller, you're probably using it for its raw damage or its status effect potential, which means you're probably going to use either the Great Katana or you're going to use a halberd or something else that does as much damage as possible, which could be likely enough the Lizard Greatsword, the Great Katana, or the Guardian Sword Spear, because within 3 damage types, those are kind of the best in those categories. And on top of that, there's one other Storm thing we did miss, which is going to be the bow builds. And if you're using any of the light or medium bows, you're probably going to be best off with either a Dexterity or a quality build. However, when you factor in every single category, Dexterity pretty much has the best in most applicable categories compared to any other stat, and that includes strength and quality. And while it is relatively close between those 3, which is only about a 3 to 4 to 5% difference, with 10% being the biggest difference, which is from the halberds, it is still important to know that between the top 3, the difference is pretty close overall, which means go whatever build you want to. But when you look at these categories, yeah, Dexterity pretty much checks almost every single box as being the best, with storm-based abilities alone. Now note, I do believe that Strength is still better overall, but when it comes to Storms, Dexterity's king. Quality's pretty good, and so is Strength, and it's so close that kind of ranking them against each other doesn't really invalidate the builds, it just means they're better at doing slightly different things. In fact, I'm actually going to go as far to say that these Storm builds are probably the most balanced build types in the game. It's just the slight differences in the top 3 that make one better than another. And even then, there's room for debate. Alright guys, thank you for getting this far in the video. I'm going to try to get the lighting video out sometime tomorrow. Otherwise, thank you again. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have an awesome day.